Hello, community. Naomi here from Aged Care Ready and founder of our group, the Aging Parent Support Group on Facebook. Welcome to another live session on a Monday night, as we usually do. We are up to episode number 8, and tonight we are lucky enough to be joined by Bob Morton, who's the co-founder of the Property Clearance Company. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you, Naomi, and it's a real pleasure to be here on a Monday night. Where would we rather be, eh?
Thank you for joining us. So tell us a little bit about you and the business, and how you help families going into care.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. We assist families really in two sets of circumstances. One set of circumstances is relevant to your members, I'm sure, which is where families are helping elderly loved ones with the transition into care. And we assist the families with all issues to do with the property and the possessions within it. So we handle, for example, the appropriate clearance of items from the home and its preparation for sale, typically. Sure. The other circumstance we work in is assisting families who have a property in a deceased estate situation, where we assist in a similar way, but obviously a different circumstance. Okay. In both sets of circumstance, we assist in two ways. We clear items from homes as one set of services, and the other is preparing it for sale.
Sure. So what do you feel are the most common issues that families face, and how can you help with that?
Yeah, well, that's quite easy. I wish I had a dollar for every time I'd heard this statement, but most families, when they approach us, often tentatively for help, because they're sort of not sure what's available and how it works, but they very often lead with, I feel quite overwhelmed in this situation, or the other common expression is, I don't know where to start. And clearly they're dealing with all of the issues associated with helping an elderly loved one transition to care, which in itself is obviously a very significant and sometimes challenging sort of undertaking. And also they have their own lives, careers, families, other responsibilities that they're sort of trying to maintain as well. So the thought then of looking in at their parents' home, which may have decades, if not a lifetime of possessions sort of built up within it. Where do we start? How do I get going here? And sort of overarching with that, they are often also very conscious of fulfilling their enduring power of attorney responsibilities, which they typically have. So they're the sort of common factors that are front of mind when they come to us.
Yeah. And you touched on in your response there about, families having to go through their loved ones' homes, and more often than not, their parents would have a lot of possessions in there that they have accumulated or collected over many years, if not decades, or their lifetime. Yeah. What options are there available for the disposal of these?
We think about it, the possessions in a home according to categories, and then based on putting items into those categories, then the disposal options become quite obvious. And I'd encourage your members, if they're considering this work, undertaking it themselves, to think in a similar way. I'll briefly explain what I mean by that. Sure. The most important category are those items that are either being retained by their elderly loved one and moved to their new home, even if it's a modest location. There's normally a favourite chair. I'll tell you what, we've moved a lot of favourite chairs, Naomi, and photos and bits and pieces like that. In that category one also, we would include items that have been gifted or retained by other family members. So they're generally the sentimental, important heirloom style items is category number one. So thinking it as a family, that's a recommendation I'd give clearly. That in a lot of ways, they're the only items that really count in a home, are those ones that have that sentimental value. The other items become less important as I briefly explain them, but the second category would be those items that could be sold cost effectively. So identifying what they are and setting those aside. The third category we would work to would be items that could be donated or reused or repurposed, perhaps. So those are items of low financial value, no sentimental value, but it could be passed to somebody who would need them. And then we get towards then it's items we would look to recycling or waste disposal options for the remainder. That's how we think about it. And if your members are considering this work themselves, that's how I'd suggest they consider it.
Sure. And I guess for those really sentimental possessions and maybe slightly less, I guess that would be a very hard decision for a family member to make. How would you suggest, or how are these decisions made, and how would you manage this?
The sentimental items in particular, look, this is really unique to each family circumstance. There's a couple of I suppose areas of experience that I could relay that might help, and that might help families who are sort of negotiating their way through this and trying to work it out. First point of experience is many of our clients over the years have sort of instinctively wanted to retain more than they really practically could.
Yeah.
And this is an understandable challenge. There's a feeling of sort of obligation and a feeling of sort of passing items through. We had one family, Lady agonised. I remember this so well. Her mother wanted to take her doll collection. She literally would have had to extend her house to take this extensive doll collection into her house. I know, and it was. She's a lovely lady, and she was agonising really through this. And frankly, she wanted about 5 or 6 of them, I think. They meant something to her from her childhood, and they knew they were really important to her mum. But she, in no way, felt she could justify extending the house for the rest of them. So there's that one issue of working through really practically what can be taken and really what we have to consider other disposal options. Similarly, there's a generational issue here in retaining items, which is really, really important. And again, can be tough at the time for families to deal with this, but handing an item down one generation is often problematic. Tastes have changed. Handing it down 2 is generally almost impossible. And this can be an area of disappointment, I know, for some families and their elderly loved ones who don't understand why their granddaughter doesn't want the large collection, which is beautiful, but is not what a 22-year-old possibly wants to put in their home. So that, again, I suppose I'm outlining these sort of quite common points of discussion, to some extent concern in families. It's working through them in a practical sense and then isolating out really those things that really count. Obviously the heirlooms, the photos of importance, the family documentation. Often in these circumstances, that documentation, it could be ancestry based, but it could be financial based, of course, financial records for the elderly ones. So it's a very unique situation if you think it through. But my advice at the end of it, and it's going to sound like a really easy bit of advice, but hard to do, and that's because it is, but just try and decide really clearly, are we keeping an item or not? And if you're not, then try and deal with it on a pragmatic basis. If you are, that's where the sentiment and the emotion comes in.
Do you find that sometimes families have to repeat the process several times to keep culling down?
Yes, if they allow themselves to be confused on that one decision. And I'll state it again because I am conscious it's very easy for me to say this, but hard to do. But really looking at any item in a home, the only decision or the main decision that a family needs to make, and my strong recommendation is, are we keeping this or not?
Yeah.
And if you are, then it's who does it go to and those sort of things. If you're not, then it comes down to the less emotive decisions, the pragmatic decisions of, can it be cost effectively sold? If so, we'll do that. If not, but it's useful, who can we donate it to? If not, can't be donated, then okay, can we recycle? And if not, then we're looking at waste disposal. But it all starts at that one decision of, are we keeping it or not? And at the risk of labouring the point, Naomi, I've met with many clients over the years, and I've tried to, and they've struggled to get away from this. They've decided they don't want the vase. I don't want to keep the vase, but they will agonise over what happens with it. Yeah. Where does it go? What does it do? And I'm not, this is an understandable situation, but try and pull yourself back from that agony of, no, we're not keeping it, move away.
Yeah. And kind of leading on from that, I guess, for the items that families aren't going to keep, they would probably consider donation more than, just disposal. Is that what you would agree with?
Yeah, I would look at the sale option first.
Yeah.
There are usually items that can be cost effectively sold, and again, we're talking here things that aren't of sentimental value, so look at the sale option. Be pragmatic about that, though. I use that word a lot. Probably already have overused it here in this call. You can very quickly test values of items by, for example, looking at internet platforms such as eBay. If you're using that platform, make sure you look for sold items only, not the advertised price. You want to see what it's sold for. And talking to dealers, potentially, who might specialise, and try and understand very quickly what the values are. And I'm going to make a comment here, which some of your members might go, might find it difficult to hear, but generally older items aren't as valuable as we as human beings instinctively think.
Yeah.
Especially as we're looking at them through an emotional lens, if you like, of, it was very important to my mum, it was important to me during my childhood. It's old. The then assumption of it's valuable financially is not always the case. So just, you can test that quite quickly with, as I said, with dealers and internet platforms. And then that will lead you to that decision of, well, it's not valuable. I don't want it to go to landfill. And it's a real passion of ours. The amount of stuff that goes to landfill that shouldn't is just is extraordinary. But if you've decided it's not of sentimental importance, it's not cost effective to sell, the donation and reuse options are extensive, and you'd quickly go to those options as a family for disposal.
Yeah. Back to the point where you mentioned that generally when families are looking at an item through a sentimental or an emotional lens and they're going to sell that item, that could potentially be a risk for them. Are there any other risks associated with undertaking the clearance of a home for families?
Yeah, I suppose I'll answer that question in the context of how we would approach it, and if you like, our methods.
Yeah.
And that's just the advice really is to your members to follow these methods. We've managed these circumstances many times, so I'm just sort of sharing what we've learned. The first principle, I suppose, is don't assume the home to be a sort of normal home and you're completing a normal set of activities, because you're not. You're completing quite a significant set of activities and dealing with a reasonably high volume of items. So assume risk and take a risk-averse approach to the work you do. And those risks that we spend a lot of time mitigating, and I'd suggest your members would. Firstly, there's a sheer physical risk of lifting and moving and bending and moving things out of cupboards and the likes. Even people of some fitness that can be quite exhausting and can expose you to some level of risk. So, think about it. I think we've all at some point in our lives been taught how to lift properly and things like that. Or if you haven't, you could YouTube it. But just think about that, because you're not just moving a few things around a home like you would normally. You'll be moving a lot of things. Secondly, I'd consider the the risks of the items you'll encounter that might have been put in the back of a cupboard 42 years ago, or in the back of a garage, or something like that.
Sounds like
and
you have some stories there.
I do. I have lots of them, but I won't go on. But chemicals, for example, in the back of garages and cupboards that were put away might be unmarked. Just be careful about handling those. Even household chemicals, terps and the likes, need to be handled sort of correctly. Look out for exposed asbestos, for example, things like that. These are all things that might be sort of in a home for many, many years, but it's not until you're moving everything out that you need to think about it. So as I said, members should really consider these things, and then basically take the appropriate steps to handle those items the proper way.
Yeah. And towards the beginning of the call, you mentioned that the second pathway of your company is to help prepare the homes for sale themselves. What advice would you give our members for that aspect after, they've done a lot of the clearance?
The first piece of advice, and I'll sort of wind back to where we started really, when you're faced with a very full home, full of a lot of memories for you and a lot of important items for your family, however, a need to sell the property, break down the clearance of the home and preparing it for sale into two separate parts. That helps with that issue I mentioned earlier about just feeling overwhelmed. So manage the clearance of the home, and you almost take a breath. I'd suggest reassess the home now it's cleared, and then work out what needs to happen or would be done to present it well for the market. And that can be anything from as simple as a clean and a tidy up of the gardens. It might be minor repairs. It might be other things that you'll need to attend to, but sort of treat it as two distinct phases. And at the risk of another story, Naomi, how many stories am I allowed? Tell me if I get to my quota.
That's okay. You're doing well so far.
But I have. I'll try and paraphrase a situation which is not uncommon. It's in a home with a young lady, and it was a very full home, and she was really in a tough state, helping her dad and bits and pieces. And she contacted us about clearing the home, but she spent the first 10 minutes talking about the colour. She's going to paint the wall of a room to prepare it for sale. And I understand why. I think because of the overwhelming nature of the activity, and she didn't know where to start, she sort of gravitated to something she could get her head around, which was choosing a colour and painting a wall. Does that make sense? It's sort of, and I sort of, we spent a lot of time and a few laughs really along the way, actually, but trying to get her just to back out of that for a bit. Let's deal with this very full home of items appropriately, then let's revisit. In the end, there was no painting actually on that home. It was clearly going to be a renovation for a buyer. And therefore that wasn't required. Not a lot of work was required in that home. Actually, it was around cleaning in the gardens, and sort of that's how it was undertaken. So that's how I'd suggest do it in two distinct stages and do them in sequence, unless there's some pressing reason that you can't.
Yeah. So moving on towards the sale of the home, should the home be completely cleared of possessions before the sale or after the sale?
That depends. It depends on a bunch of factors. But when you get to the stage or starting to consider these sort of items, I'm often asked actually about, do I sell it as is with everything in it and worry about it later? If there's an interim step, do I leave some furniture as staging or styling? And then there's another step of, do I clear everything out? My first piece of advice is actually engage a real estate agent quite early who can give really good advice on that. When you find a real agent, a good agent, you're putting them in your corner, if you like, to use a boxing analogy, putting them in your corner, and they are expert, obviously, in, for example, defining the likely buyer profile of that home, which then makes that decision for you. Do I clear it or do I leave some furniture, or do I empty it? And I'll just explain exactly what I mean by that just quickly.
Yeah.
In a reasonably common circumstance, if your members are dealing with an elderly loved one's home, they've lived in it for a long time, and they're probably in their later years, late 70s, 80s, 90s, that home and the furniture in it would not really appeal to buyers who might be in their 30s with 2 young children.
Yeah.
So that's the sort of decision point for me. Would you be leaving it in a presentation style which would appeal to the buyers, buyers of the profile that would purchase that property? Often the case with an elderly person's home is it would not, the furniture and the style would not appeal to the buyer profile. Therefore, you would clear the home.
Yeah.
Again, I have an opinion on this and experience, and I share it, but I also always say, appoint a real estate agent earlier than most people would normally do it.
Yeah.
So they can help you with these things. Don't leave it too late where they're just sort of putting the marketing material together and you haven't had an opportunity to leverage their expertise and advice in this sort of area.
Yeah. I guess for me personally, if I had to clear out my parents' home, I would just feel that was way too big of a job for me. It would be way too overwhelming. And I guess that's why people reach out to services like yours and like ours. Because like you said, it's just not knowing where to start. It's completely overwhelming. So if families wanted to consider engaging professional help, how long do you think this process would usually take, and roughly how much would it cost?
The 2 big questions. Look, if you were to engage a professional firm, I think you can expect that they should be able to clear a home in a period between sort of 3 to 7 days.
Okay.
And that's quite a big range, I know, but a home can be a modest 1-bedroom unit.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be a 5-bedroom home with a 3-car garage and associated. So the variation in home is quite significant. In our experience, you should be able to engage a professional firm for somewhere between sort of $2,000 to $8,000.
Yeah.
Broadly, the exceptions, and the only exceptions are very, very, very full homes, which you occasionally encounter. Regional locations can be a factor, and also unusually large homes. And again, they tend to come in lifestyle blocks. So I go and I inspect the home, and I've had a few of these. I won't bore you with another story, but I'll just sort of merge them all together. You go and inspect the lovely 4-bedroom home, and you're just about to leave, and then they say, then there's the garage, and it turns out it's a 5-bay
it's bigger
garage,
than the house.
which is absolutely it is. So they're the sort of situations which might go outside those ranges, I suppose. And as a family, we have put together time estimates and more than estimates, basically, time frames to complete this. As a family, your sort of person days you would have to allocate would vary between sort of 4 to sort of 20, 25 in our experience, based on a small property and a big property. And the reason it doesn't take us that long, by the way, or other firms in our services area, it takes families longer, understandably, because items have emotional value. And carry an emotional attachment of some sort, so it takes longer. Also, firms like ours and others have done this hundreds of times, so we have methods. Most families would be doing it for the first time only, so they're sort of learning as they go.
And they're probably more likely doing it on the weekends or in the evenings and things like that, whereas a firm themselves would have dedicated times during the week to go in and do this. And then
they would, or they're relying on, it's a risk of another story, or they're relying on nephew, I'll call him Nephew Jim, shall I? Who's promised to come around for several weekends in a row and hasn't had time. And that can be a common frustration as well, really. But,
And I guess with the cost as well, that, you know, some of the benefits of offloading some of these possessions for sale could offset that cost as well slightly.
That's right. And if you're looking to engage a firm, they should be able to help you with that. So they should be able to offer that as a managed service.
Yeah.
I'm wary most organisations would sell on your behalf. Some organisations would come and buy items off you. My advice in that area is just be careful. It's very hard for families who are looking at, for example, an old clock. They're actually not sure, because who would know, unless you're an expert in vintage clocks, whether it's worth $10 or $1,000 sometimes. It's very hard to know. So selling on consignment, as I would call it, I think has become a more comfortable way where you allow the organisation you're engaging with to earn a sales commission. However, you see their incentive is the same as yours, really, which is to get the best financial return on the items that they can get.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, community out there, if you have any questions, please do pop them in the comments below. That's what I'm looking at over here to my left. And Bob, you are personally located in Brisbane, but you are a national company, is that correct?
Yes, we are. Yeah, we've provided services in every state and territory, sort of metro and regional. We've the work we do in the space it's a real responsibility. And as I say in my opening statement with staff training, Naomi, it's a real privilege too when you are, and responsibility when you're working in families' homes in these circumstances. It really is.
Sure. Yeah. Was there anything else that you wanted to add, Bob?
I suppose a community service statement. I don't know, as families out there, if you're managing this, sort of be kind to each other. It can be, there's a lot of strain and stress, understandably, in the circumstances around transition anyway. And I suppose, again, I've seen unnecessary angst, and sometimes I assume probably long-term relationship issues develop between families in this highly pressured situation. So it's a case of, in most cases, people are trying to do the right thing. They just do things differently, but try and be kind and with each other, and sort of take it as you go, and ultimately you'll get there.
Yeah, one step at a time, and just breathe.
It's the only way.
Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you, community, for tuning in. If you're wanting to get hold of Bob or his team, I will tag the company in the post. Until then, we will finish up tonight, and we have another session coming up next week. So stay tuned for the subject topic. Thanks again. Good night.
Good night.